Okay, imagine this for a second. You've poured hours, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of hours into a virtual world, not just playing casually, but like really dedicating yourself.
Right.
We're talking about the kind of commitment where you might find yourself doing what players bluntly call poop socking.
Yeah.
You know, sitting there semi-AFK, maybe for days, just waiting for that rare digital dragon, that ancient beast to finally show up. You've got your bat phone, your actual phone probably, ready for that alert, that text message saying, "It's time, drop everything, log in now, join the raid force." Your guildmates are counting on you, you've strategized, you've invested time, you've built these bonds. This isn't just hitting buttons, it becomes a serious commitment, almost like a second job or second life for some.
It's an incredible level of investment, really. Time, emotion, planning.
Exactly. And then picture this. After all that planning, all that waiting, all that emotional energy poured in,
Yeah.
a rival guild just sweeps in. Maybe they use some clever loophole they found in the game's rules. Or maybe they do something really disruptive, like deliberately training a huge swarm of angry monsters right onto your carefully assembled raid group.
Oh, yeah, the training tactic. Brutal.
Wipes you out instantly, ruins your night, maybe your whole week's worth of planning.
Yeah.
All that effort just gone. The frustration, the sheer anger, that feeling of like betrayal, you can almost feel it, right? That kick in the gut.
It's visceral. Absolutely visceral. Especially if you're sinking so much time.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that doesn't just, skim the headlines. We go deep. We plunge right into these complex topics to find the surprising, often kind of hidden truths underneath. And today, we are embarking on a really fascinating and honestly pretty tumultuous journey. We're doing a deep dive into the history of raid disputes on Project 1999's Blue server.
A classic server, for sure.
Right. And this isn't just about, some old video game drama. It's actually this incredible living case study. It tells us so much about human behavior, about how communities try to govern themselves, and about the unintended consequences, often really far-reaching consequences of game design, especially in these super competitive online spaces.
Yeah, it's a microcosm of real-world issues in a way.
Totally. So our mission today is to unravel what our main source calls the vicious cycle. This repeating pattern, right? Intense conflict between players, then the administrators reacting, trying to fix things, which then affects player psychology, leading to more conflict. It just keeps going.
And it snowballs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it all culminated in something pretty unprecedented. The indefinite suspension of several major guilds from the server's endgame raiding scene. We want to explore, really get into the weeds, how this pervasive toxicity, that's the word the admins use a lot, wasn't just, a few bad apples causing trouble.
Right, it wasn't just individual behavior.
No, it became systemic, almost like an inevitable outcome, something woven right into the fabric of how this particular virtual world worked, how the competition itself bred this outcome.
And to really dig into this, we're fortunate because we have some incredibly revealing sources. Our primary one is this detailed report titled The Vicious Cycle, a deep dive into Project 1999 Blue's history of raid disputes.
Sounds comprehensive.
It really is.
Yeah.
And alongside that, we've got the actual suspension notices the staff put out, which are sometimes surprisingly emotional, very candid, and also these detailed raid suspension logs that kept records.
Wow.
So together, these give us this unusually transparent, almost like clinical look at a problem that plagued this server for well over a decade. It's a goldmine if you want to understand how these complex virtual societies grapple with very real challenges. Things like resource scarcity, intense competition, and ultimately how you even try to govern something like this.
It really gives you a window into the messiness.
Yeah.
Right? Trying to manage human nature when it's playing out online.
Exactly. The messy reality.
Okay, so let's really unpack this then. Before we jump into the disputes themselves, for anyone listening who maybe isn't familiar with this specific niche of gaming, what exactly is Project 1999? And why is its design so absolutely critical to understanding all this conflict?
Sure. So Project 1999, or P99 as people call it, is essentially a time capsule. It's an emulated version of the original classic 1999 MMORPG EverQuest.
The granddaddy of MMOs, basically.
One of them, for sure. And P99 specifically aims to recreate EverQuest as it was during its first couple of expansions, Kunark and Velius, which many players consider like the golden era.
Right.
Now, the key thing here is it's not a modern MMO. It deliberately strips away all the conveniences we take for granted now, things like automated group finders or, crucially, instanced dungeons.
Okay, hold on. No instance content. Just explain that for everyone. Instanced means like your own private copy of a dungeon, right?
Exactly. In most modern games, when your group enters a dungeon or a raid zone, you get your own private copy. Nobody else can interfere. You fight the boss, you get the loot, everyone eventually gets a turn.
Okay, so P99 doesn't have that. What does that mean in practice?
It means everything is open world. There's only one version of that high-level dragon's lair. There's only one ancient temple raid zone. All players, all guilds, and the entire server are competing for the exact same finite number of powerful raid bosses.
Wow, okay.
These bosses spawn in fixed locations out in the world on timers, and when they die, they drop incredibly powerful, often unique gear that everyone wants. This setup immediately creates what's called a zero-sum environment.
Zero-sum, meaning?
Meaning for one person or one group to win, another person or group must lose. If my guild kills the dragon and gets the epic sword, your guild doesn't, period. There's no sharing, no second chances until it respawns maybe days later. Your gain is my absolute loss.
That sounds inherently conflict-prone.
Oh, absolutely. It's baked into the design.
And didn't the players themselves have a pretty blunt way of describing this? I remember reading they compared it to playing Monopoly.
Yes. That comparison comes up in the sources, and it's perfect, if a little cynical. The analogy was that playing high-end P99 rating was like playing Monopoly, where the objective, as some players apparently put it, was to be an asshole depriving others of opportunities.
Wow, okay, so not just winning, but actively stopping others from winning.
Precisely. It captures that core dynamic perfectly. It wasn't just about your guild succeeding, it was often equally about making sure rival guilds failed. This inherent friction, this direct, unavoidable competition for scarce, high-value rewards. That's the seed. That's what breeds the resentment, the grudges, the toxicity we're going to talk about. Cooperation between rival top guilds, almost impossible in this system.
And let's layer onto that the sheer time commitment we talked about earlier, that poop socking, the bad phones. Remind us again just how intense that was.
It's hard to overstate. You're not just logging on for an hour after work. We're talking about coordinating dozens of people, sometimes up to 72 players for a full raid around unpredictable in-game timers.
So real-world schedules get bent around the game.
Completely. Setting alarms for 3 a.m., skipping sleep, missing family dinners or social events, all to have enough people online to sit in some virtual cave staring at an empty spot where a boss might appear hours from now.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. And it's not just passive waiting. You're semi-AFK, maybe browsing the web, but always alert, ready to jump into action. Now imagine doing that for hours, maybe days. You finally gather your forces, you're moving in for the kill.
Yeah.
And suddenly a rival guild pulls that stunt. They train a horde of monsters onto you, causing chaos, wiping your raid. Or they use spells to make the boss invulnerable, stalling it so you can't get the first to engage credit, effectively locking it down for potentially hours.
Oh, after all that effort, the sheer frustration must be astronomical. It's not just losing a game objective. It's like someone deliberately setting fire to hours, days of your actual life.
Exactly. That investment makes the loss feel personal, deeply unfair. And that intense emotional reaction is critical fuel for the toxicity the admins kept referencing. You see it reflected in the suspension notice itself.
Right, you mentioned that notice was unusually candid.
Extremely. The staff flat out said they were downright tired of it. Tired of the constant bickering, the endless petitions flooding their inbox, the sheer amount of volunteer time consumed by mediating these disputes.
That doesn't sound like a typical admin notice at all. It sounds weary.
Weary is a good word. Almost exasperated. And what's really key here is that this final indefinite suspension wasn't for one specific rule break, like cheating. It was for this broader, fuzzier thing, toxicity and immature behavior.
So a judgment on the overall culture, not just one action.
Precisely. And that signals this huge shift. It's the admins basically saying, look, our usual punishments, the 7-day bans, the 14-day bans, they haven't worked. This behavior is baked in. The notice explicitly puts the responsibility back on the players, on the guild leaders, to figure out how to fix their own community.
Like an admission that the administrative tools just weren't enough anymore.
It really feels like an admission of defeat in that sense. A recognition that the conflict stemmed from something deeper than rule-breaking, something inherent in the game's design and the community's response to it.
Okay, so if that indefinite suspension marks the breaking point, the culmination, let's rewind. Let's trace this vicious cycle from the beginning. The report talks about a foundational era, roughly 2009 to 2012. What did the raid scene look like back then in the server's infancy?
In those very early days, it was simpler in a way. The scene was largely dominated by just two main guilds, Inglorious Bastards, usually called IB, and Transcendence.
Just two big players.
Primarily, yeah. And interestingly, right from the start, the volunteer staff running P99 saw the writing on the wall. They recognized the potential for major friction.
Even back then.
Oh, yeah. They understood that with this open-world, zero-sum design, having two powerful groups competing for the same limited bosses was basically guaranteed conflict. So they stepped in almost immediately, proactively.
Wow. Okay. So they didn't wait for things to explode.
Nope. They implemented and actively enforced a rotation system. This was entirely top-down. The GMs, the administrators, would literally dictate which guild got to kill which boss and when.
So forced cooperation, essentially.
Pretty much. The goal was clearly to ensure both guilds got some access to the high-end content and hopefully prevent the kind of brawls they anticipated. This is really significant because it set a crucial precedent right away. Player conflict wasn't going to sort itself out. It was going to require constant GM intervention, constant mediation. The staff basically acknowledged the design flaw and took on the role of peacekeepers from day one.
But that sounds fragile. Did that GM-enforced rotation last?
You guessed it. It was effective for a while, but ultimately short-lived. The thing that broke it was the emergence of a third major raiding guild called Divinity.
Adding another competitor to the mix.
Exactly. Suddenly, trying to juggle rotations for three powerful, hungry guilds became incredibly complex, arguably impossible for the volunteer staff, so they made a decision that would fundamentally change everything.
Which?
They scrapped the rotation system entirely. Just abandon it.
Wow. So they went from tightly controlled cooperation to what? A free-for-all.
Completely. A total pivot. From that structured, top-down cooperative model to an unregulated, highly competitive free-for-all. And this shift was absolutely foundational for everything that followed.
What happened immediately after they dropped the rotation?
Chaos, basically. Well, organized chaos.
Yeah.
Inglorious Bastards, OB, pretty quickly established overwhelming dominance in this new free-for-all environment. Their success, though, directly fueled the rise of a powerful new rival, Dark Ascension, or DA.
So the competition just intensified.
Massively. The rivalry between IB and DA became legendary. They pushed every boundary, bent every unwritten rule, sometimes broke them outright. Things got so heated, so out of control that it forced the staff to intervene again, but this time not with cooperation, but with the server's first formal, codified raid rule set. And people really didn't like it.
Okay, so what did this first attempt at formal rules look like? How did they try to impose order?
The core of it was this. A raid target, like a dragon, was officially awarded to the first guild to have 15 non-AFK players physically present at the spawn location.
15 non-AFK players. Okay, that sounds specific. The intention was probably to stop guilds from just parking one guy there indefinitely.
That was likely the idea, yeah. To create a clear, objective measure of who got there first with a meaningful force. But the unintended consequence, it created this whole new, incredibly tedious meta. Poop sucking. This rule basically incentivized guilds to gather large groups, 15 or more players, and just sit at the spawn point, semi-AFK, sometimes for literal days, just waiting.
So that's where that practice really took root and became the standard because of that rule.
Exactly. It became the dominant strategy. You had to commit huge chunks of player time, not actively playing, but just being present to secure your claim under the rules. It was exhausting, boring, sleep-depriving, but it was the meta. This critical shift away from the negotiated cooperation of the early rotation system towards this brutal, resource-heavy race for content governed by the first-to-engage principle that set the stage. It cemented FTE as a core logic of P99 rating and basically defined the terms for every single conflict that would follow for the next decade.
Okay, so that foundational era establishes this hyper-competitive, FTE-driven, poop-socking meta. Now we move into the next period the report identifies the age of escalation, running roughly 2013 to 2018. It sounds like things really ramped up here.
Oh, they absolutely did. This era was just relentless. You see the competitive dynamic pushed to its absolute extreme. Guilds develop incredibly sophisticated tactics, both for securing kills and for disrupting rivals. We see major server-wide scandals erupt. And crucially, there's a real crisis of trust in the administration.
And the guilds themselves weren't static entities, were they? There was a lot of merging and reforming.
Constantly shifting alliances and names, yeah. It gets complicated, but basically the big guilds from the early days didn't just disappear. They fractured, merged, reformed under new banners. For example, Inglorious Bastards eventually merged into Transatlantic Rampage. Dark Ascension, their old rivals, broke up, reformed as Fusion, and many core members later ended up in the Mystical Order, or TMO.
Okay.
Then later, Transatlantic Rampage joined forces with another guild, Taken, to become Awakened. And TMO eventually merged with groups called Forsaken and Asgard to create Aftermath.
Wow, it's like a complex family tree of rivalries. So underneath the changing names, it was often the same core groups of players carrying forward these conflicts.
That's exactly the point the report makes, and it's critical. These fluid structures show that the rivalries, the grudges, the monopoly mindset, they were persistent. They were carried forward by the same essential groups of people. So the conflict didn't just fade away with the guild disbanding, it just evolved, often intensified, under a new guild tag. It suggests the problem was deeply rooted in the player dynamics and the competitive culture, not just the temporary name of a guild.
And this escalating intensity, this ingrained rivalry, led to some truly explosive moments, right? Like the Kara Firm incident. That sounds notorious.
Kara Firm, yes. January 2016. This wasn't just controversial, it was genuinely server-defining. The Guild Rampage, which, remember, had roots in the old IB, made this incredibly divisive decision. They decided to awaken Kara Firm.
Who's Kara Firm?
Kara Firm, also known as the Sleeper, was this unique, super powerful boss locked away in a zone called Sleeper's Tomb. He was designed as basically a one-time event for the entire server. Once awakened and defeated, he and the event associated with him would be gone permanently.
Wait, permanently? As in removed from the game forever
Right.
for everyone on that server?
Forever. Gone. No future players, no other guilds would ever get to experience that specific content again.
Wow. I can see why that would be controversial.
It infuriated a huge portion of the player base. The feeling was overwhelming. This unique, irreplaceable piece of the shared world, this major endgame challenge, was just deleted, destroyed for one guild's temporary glory and unique loot. It was seen by many as the absolute peak of that monopoly mindset, prioritizing one group's short-term achievement over the long-term health and enjoyment of the entire community. It left a really deep scar on the server's psyche.
Just pure zero-sum thinking taken to its absolute extreme.
Exactly. And alongside these huge dramatic events, the day-to-day tactics within that FTE meta got nastier too.
Yeah.
More aggressive, more disruptive.
Like what kind of things?
Well, we already mentioned training. Intentionally luring huge packs of dangerous monsters onto a rival raid force to cause wipes and chaos, that became depressingly common. Another big one was stalling. Using invulnerability spells or clever kiting techniques to keep a raid boss alive but unkillable, purely to prevent rivals from getting the FTE tag. This could lock down a boss for hours, sometimes even days, just pure disruption.
And the admins were trying to police this.
Constantly. If you look at the raid suspension logs from this period, they are just filled with entries for these kinds of offenses. Training Lord Jelinek, stalling Nagafen, interfering with rival guild's attempt on Vulak. It paints a clear picture of the staff locked in this constant, exhausting struggle to manage these tactics, which were direct results of the FT system they themselves had essentially created. It was like playing whack-a-mole with bad behavior.
And this era also saw some major scandals that really shook player trust in the administration itself, right? Tell me about Fruvigate.
Fruvigate, yeah, that was a big one. Deeply damaging. It centered primarily around the Mystical Order, TMO, one of the top guilds then. It started with Whispers, you know. Suddenly, incredibly cheap high-end gear and vast amounts of platinum, the game's currency, started flooding the market. Too cheap. Too much.
Something wasn't right.
Exactly. Players started investigating, tracking transactions. They found huge amounts of newly minted platinum, way beyond what could be earned legitimately, traced back to a few accounts, mostly within TMO. The admins eventually confirmed it. A major exploit allowing players to duplicate platinum, basically print infinite money.
Wow. And the consequences?
A massive ban wave. It crippled TMO, fractured the guild, and sent shockwaves across the server. But the real impact, it drew this undeniable line connecting illicit activities, specifically real money trading, RMT, selling game items for real cash directly to the top-level raid scene. It showed that real-world money and cheating were actively influencing the power balance in the game, corrupting the whole competitive environment and making fair governance even harder.
That must have really eroded trust. And then there was the whole situation with GM Sirkin. He sounds like a central figure.
He was for years. GM Sirkin was the main guy, sometimes the only guy, handling raid disputes. His rulings were law, basically. But they were often incredibly controversial. Players constantly complained about perceived bias or inconsistent interpretations.
Relying on one person for everything sounds risky.
Hugely risky. It created this massive single point of failure. And that trust completely shattered when it eventually came out that Sirkin himself had been leaking confidential spawn timer information, super critical data for rating to a player.
No way. A GM leaking secrets.
Yep. His removal triggered this profound crisis of trust. It wasn't just about one bad apple. It exposed how fragile the whole system was. Relying so heavily on one person's judgment and integrity, the community felt betrayed, understandably.
So how did the administration try to recover from that, losing their main raid guy under such circumstances?
Their response was logical, really. They tried to fix the structural problem. They replaced the single GM model with a multi-person body, the Raid Dispute Committee.
Okay, decentralizing it makes sense.
Yeah.
More oversight, less reliance on one person.
Exactly. The intention was clear. Create a more consistent, impartial, transparent process. Get away from the perception of arbitrary, single GM rulings. But here's the tragic part, really.
Okay.
Despite this sensible structural change, despite the new committee, the conflicts didn't stop. In fact, they arguably continued to escalate into the next era.
So changing the referees didn't change the game itself.
Precisely. It strongly suggested the root issue wasn't just one flawed GM. It was the inherently impossible task of trying to fairly referee this zero-sum game, especially when players were constantly inventing new ways to push the limits and exploit the rules. The new committee inherited the exact same cycle of petitions, disputes, accusations, and ultimately player frustration. They were stuck in the same vicious cycle.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the modern era, 2019 onwards, which culminates in that dramatic, indefinite suspension. How did those old rivalries, those ingrained behaviors, carry over into the newer guilds that emerged?
It was almost seamless, really, like passing a torch or maybe a Molotov cocktail, depending on your perspective. The competitive culture, the aggressive tactics, the deep-seated rivalries from the age of escalation, they were just adopted wholesale by the next generation of guilds.
Were mainly who at this point?
Well, following this complex lineages we talked about, Awakened eventually split. Part of it formed Core, which then merged with another guild, Paradigm Shift, to create Riot.
Okay, so Riot has roots way back.
Definitely. And Aftermath's lineage continued through guilds named Ghost, then Garrist, and finally became Freedom.
Got it. Riot and Freedom.
And the third major player was Azure Guard. They were a long-standing guild around for ages, with their own history of being involved in disputes and suspensions. They remained a central force.
So these three, Riot, Freedom, and Azure Guard, they became the new power players.
Exactly. They became known collectively and somewhat notoriously as the Big Three, and they absolutely inherited and arguably perfected the competitive behaviors and the monopoly mindset of their predecessors. The cycle of conflict, the one-upmanship, it just continued, maybe even intensified.
Which must have meant even more work for that raid dispute committee.
Unbelievable amounts. The sources describe them being completely swamped, just buried under this relentless avalanche of petitions from these guilds.
Just constantly complaining about each other.
Constantly. Every little interaction, every perceived slight became grounds for a formal petition. It reached a point where the staff had to try something to stem the tide.
And that led to the crying wolf policy. What was that about?
Yeah, the committee basically said, look, we're getting too many frivolous complaints. If you file petitions that are baseless, overly dramatic, or clearly just meant to harass your rivals, you might get punished.
Trying to disincentivize bogus complaints. Did it work?
Well, yes and no. The logs show they did issue suspensions for baseless complaints or crying wolf. But it didn't solve the core problem. What happened instead? The guilds just got better at framing their complaints. They continued to weaponize the administrative process.
How so?
Every minor incident, every ambiguous rule interaction was meticulously documented and submitted as evidence. Filing a petition became a tactical weapon. Even if your case was weak, you could tie up the admin's time, maybe get your rival a short suspension, disrupt their rating. The petition system itself became part of the battlefield.
That sounds incredibly draining for the volunteer staff.
Utterly exhausting. Which brings us, finally, to that ultimate act. what the report calls administrative surrender, the indefinite raid suspension of Riot, Freedom, and Azure Guard.
Indefinite. That's the key word. How is this different from all the previous bans?
Fundamentally different. Nearly all previous bans were for fixed durations, 7 days, 14 days, 30 days, maybe 60 for really serious stuff and tied to specific rule violations. Illegal FTE on track and on, training raid mobs, exploiting bug. Very concrete.
Okay.
This indefinite suspension. It wasn't for one specific incident. It was for the overall pattern, for general toxicity and immature behavior. It was the admin saying, this entire situation is untenable.
And that candid language in the notice, being downright tired of it,
Yeah.
that really was an admission of defeat, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It's them throwing their hands up, saying, we can't police this anymore. We don't have the resources, the energy, maybe even the tools to manage this level of constant antagonism. And crucially, they shifted the burden.
Ow.
They explicitly told the guild's leaders, you need to figure this out. You need to come up with a plan for how you're going to improve the situation. It was a direct transfer of responsibility. The admins essentially stepped back from being the primary referees in this specific conflict.
So it was like a strategic withdrawal, pulling back from the front lines of this endless rules war.
That's a perfect way to put it. A strategic withdrawal from the rules arms race. They were declaring that the problem wasn't just about rule breaking anymore. It was a social breakdown, a broken community dynamic that had failed repeatedly to regulate itself despite years of administrative prodding and punishment. They basically said, we've tried rules, bans, committees. Nothing fixed the core issue. It's on you now, players.
And you can really see that progression in the suspension logs themselves, can't you? From specific actions to this broader toxicity.
Clearly. You look back at, say, 2014, Azure Guard gets 7 days for kill and track and on while lockout. Very specific rule breach. Or IB gets 14 days for kill stealing. Again, a definable action.
All right.
Then move forward. 2015, TMO gets 4 days for training, interfering with Zygos. Okay, more aggressive, disruptive tactics emerging. But then look at 2016. Awaken gets 10 days for disgusting behavior from guild members.
Oh, see, the language is changing. It's broader, more judgmental.
Exactly. It's shifting from mechanics to behavior. Then 2017, Aftermath gets 10 days for crying wolf, soliciting a concession under false pretenses. That's weaponizing the system itself.
And it all builds up to that 2020 entry. Azure Guard and Riot suspended indefinitely for toxicity, with the condition being basically fewer petitions. It's not about what they did in one instance, but the overall pattern exhausting the staff.
Precisely. It marks that shift from punishing individual acts to trying to address a systemic cultural problem. And even that wasn't necessarily the end. You see later entries, like in 2022, Riot and Vanquish, a successor guild, getting 7 days for mutual training during Wulak attempt. The habits persisted. It's this relentless cycle, this inability of the community to break free from the zero-sum conflict that finally pushed the admins to that unprecedented indefinite suspension. They just couldn't keep refereeing the endless war.
Okay, let's pull back then and look at the bigger picture, thematically.
Yeah.
After digging through all this history, this decade plus of conflict, what does it really tell us about rulemaking itself, especially in these kinds of hyper-competitive online worlds?
It's a fascinating lesson, actually. The history of P99's raid rules isn't a story of progress towards a stable, fairer system. It's much more like a reactive administrative arms race.
An arms race. How so?
Well, the admins make a rule, right? Like the initial rotation. Players adapt, new problems arise, like the third guild. So the admins react, abandon the rotation for free-for-all, conflict explodes, so they react again, institute the 15-player camping rule. Players adapt again, invent poop socking. So the admins essentially shift to the FTE system. Players adapt again, weaponizing it with training and stalling. See the pattern.
Yeah, every solution creates a new problem or at least a new loophole for players to exploit.
Exactly. Every administrative action was met with a player counteraction, forcing the admins to react again. It wasn't proactive governance. It was constant reactive patching against player behavior that was always one step ahead, always finding the edge.
Which explains why the raid committee eventually started talking about rule lawyering, right? Saying they'd enforce the spirit of the rules, not just the letter. That sounds like frustration.
Massive frustration. It's a clear admission that players were becoming experts at twisting the rules, finding ways to do things the admins obviously considered unfair or nefarious, but that technically maybe didn't break the exact wording of Rule 7, subsection B, paragraph 3.
Turning the rulebook itself into another weapon.
Precisely. And petitions were the ammunition. Filing complaints became a core strategy, a way to use the administrative system itself to gain an advantage over rivals, bog them down, maybe get them suspended. The staff's later warnings about frivolous petitions and consolidating complaints showed just how weary they became of being used as pawns in the guild's own game.
Okay, so that's the internal dynamic. What about external factors? Did things happening outside the strict game mechanics, like real-world economics, play a role in this whole economy of conflict?
Oh, absolutely. We can't ignore that. Fruvigate, the platinum duping scandal, is the prime example. It, along with other documented cases of RMT real money trading, proved that real-world money was flowing into the game and directly influencing power dynamics.
How so?
If you can buy the best gear or huge amounts of currency with real crush, even if it's against the rules, it gives you a massive competitive advantage. It raises the stakes enormously. Suddenly, controlling those raid bosses isn't just about in-game power. It's potentially linked to real financial gain or loss for some players involved in RMT. That introduces this powerful, corrupting external incentive that a volunteer admin team is just not equipped to handle. It makes the competition even more cutthroat.
And psychologically, how did that core zero-sum design, that monopoly mindset, really shape how players viewed each other?
It's fundamental. In a system where one guild's win is inherently another's loss, it's almost inevitable that you stop seeing competitors as respected rivals in a fair contest. They become obstacles to be overcome, sometimes eliminated by almost any means necessary.
Especially with that huge time investment involved.
Exactly. When you've sunk days into poop socking for a target, the idea of a rival guild snatching it feels like a personal attack, a theft of your time and effort. It breeds animosity, and then layer on the anonymity of the internet.
Right, people behave differently online.
Definitely. It lowers inhibitions. That immature antagonistic behavior, the admins complained about the trash talk, the training, the griefing. It thrives when you're hidden behind a screen and a character name. Things are said and done that probably wouldn't happen face to face.
And didn't the server structure itself kind of encourage this? With public forums for disputes.
Yeah, that's another fascinating piece. The official P99 website had a very public Rants and Flames forum. This wasn't some hidden corner. It was an official space where every dispute, every accusation, every insult could be aired for the entire community to see.
So it became a public spectacle.
Completely. It institutionalized the conflict.
Yeah.
And incredibly, it became another competitive arena. Winning an argument on the forums, publicly shaming a rival guild, destroying their reputation that was seen by some as a legitimate tactic, a way to gain an edge, undermine morale. It just poured gasoline on the fire, turning private disputes into server-wide dramas.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, after this incredibly detailed journey through P99 Blue's history, what's the big takeaway? What does this whole saga really mean?
I think the clearest message, the unavoidable conclusion, is that the toxicity wasn't random. It wasn't just a few bad people. It was a predictable, almost inevitable feature that emerged directly from the game's core design, that fixed resource, zero-sum competition interacting with human nature in a high-stakes online environment.
So design is destiny, in a way.
In many ways, yes. This whole story is this incredibly compelling, if cautionary, case study in community governance colliding with flawed design. All the administrative efforts, the rotations, the rule sets, the committees, they were ultimately reactive patches on a system inherently built for conflict. It was an unwinnable arms race for the admins against player adaptation and competition.
And that final indefinite suspension, that's the ultimate signal that the old ways just failed.
It's the white flag in that arms race. It's the administration explicitly saying, our tools, rules, punishments, mediation are exhausted. They haven't solved the underlying problem. By putting the onus back on the players to figure it out, they conceded that this wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore. It was about a fundamental breakdown in social organization, a failure of the community, particularly its most competitive elements, to find a sustainable way to coexist.
A systemic failure, not just individual transgressions.
Exactly. It's the final act in this decade-long drama, a testament to the enduring power of conflict baked into the system, an endless war, like you said, fought with pixels, policy, psychology, and just raw, unrelenting competition.
An endless war waged with pixels and policy.
Yeah.
It really sticks with you. So, thinking about our listeners, what lessons can we maybe take away from this digital battlefield? Does it tell us anything about managing conflict, building communities, maybe even how we handle limited resources in the real world?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, like, can a system that is fundamentally designed for intense, zero-sum conflict ever truly foster long-term cooperation? Or is it always eventually going to push towards breakdown, towards that administrative surrender, when the human element just gets overwhelmed by the competitive drive. Something definitely worth thinking about. Well, thank you for joining us on this very deep dive into Project 1999's turbulent history. It's been fascinating, if a bit intense at times.
It certainly has a lot to unpack there.
We hope it's given all of you listening some food for thought about online worlds, human behavior under pressure, and maybe even those bigger questions about competition, community, and governance. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep thinking deeply.